My name is Ann Silvis, and I'm the Program Leader for Community and Economic Development for University of Illinois Extension. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Water Systems and Countywide Solutions. Today we have Bill Teichmiller. Bill is CEO for EJ Water Cooperative, which is based out of Dietrich, Illinois. EJ Water Cooperative is the fastest growing water system in Illinois. It serves members in Effingham, Jasper, Clark, Clay, Cumberland, Edwards, Richland, Sangamon, Shelby, Fayette, Crawford, Montgomery, and Christian counties. The system has more than 2,000 miles of water mains, 10,000 plus members, and serves about 30,000 people. EJ Water Cooperative works closely with USDA Rural Development and the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity as its main funding source. We're really pleased that Bill is able to join us today to describe the growth and development of EJ Water Cooperative. Bill, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, and appreciate everyone's time during the lunch hour here. I just wanted to unpack and walk through a little bit about EJ Water, and hopefully the time everyone will kind of start to learn that we're really a kind of a collaborating, partnering group that just wants to help communities and the rural area with ground. So I just as part of the walkthrough, I wanted to kind of give everyone kind of a brief history of what EJ is. So what we are, we're a non-for-profit 501c12, which is organized just like the electric co-ops, which most people are pretty familiar with. And the reason of why we started, so I'm not sure all the folks on the call, but in central and downstate Illinois, where the second glacier kind of stopped, there isn't really good groundwater downstate. And so there was always a problem, especially during dry periods, that local communities and folks in the rural area would end up either hauling water, certainly conserving water, and it was always a problem. So here locally in the little town of Dietrich, which is in Effingham County, just outside of Effingham, the city of Effingham, the local school was always running into problems of not having a plentiful water supply. So back in 1988, roughly 89, several local men, as you'd expect, at the coffee shop, so to speak, in a small town, started talking about, how do we solve this problem? How do we develop a good plan forward? So out of this evolved what is today EJ Water, out of just that very simple concept, which was how do we provide, plentiful water to the local school. So the hurdle we had in 1993 was we had to have 300 members to get the thing launched, and it took several years to get folks convinced that this was the right thing to do. So here we are today, some 20 plus years later. As was mentioned at the header of the call, we're serving over 10,000 retail customers in 12 counties in south central Illinois, and then we wholesale quite a bit of water to neighboring systems and communities within our service area. And then one of the other things that we've been doing the last probably 10 plus years is we provide a lot of turnkey O&M services, back office services, to 7 sewer systems and 4 neighboring water systems. So what's kind of interesting of late in the last year, the biggest contract that we manage is the city of Centralia, which is a little bit of an unusual relationship in that the city obviously has staff at the water and sewer plant, but what they didn't have was a really high level experienced superintendent. So we're providing that to the city, which just augments their workforce. And interestingly enough, in that particular case, the workforce is union. We're a non-union shop, so we've been able to navigate through that issue actually pretty easily, which was good. So what we've done with Centralia, we've set up a really good win-win situation with the city. Moving on, this kind of gives everyone a map, more of a picture of our system. So actually what everyone's looking at here is we use ISRI for our asset management and GIS, and so this is just a Polaroid of that. We laughingly look at it and say this looks like North America and Canada, and of course Alaska over in the northwest. And then we do have some folks that we serve just outside of Springfield, Illinois, which are not contiguous with the system. But that gives everyone kind of an idea of the area that we take care of. It's around 2,400 square miles, so it's a pretty big geography. And then you'll notice the little green labels. Those are at basically our location of our trucks, so that folks in the office and others that are tied into the system always know where our assets are and our folks. So that's real helpful from a dispatch standpoint. So I just want to kind of get right into some background. So the demographics of the water industry, I think, is always a good place to start. For those that know much about the water industry, it's a highly fragmented utility, and I want to kind of share a couple comparisons. So in the telephone, roughly a little over 1,000 telephone companies, about 2,500 natural gas. There's 3,300 electric utilities, and then of course you slide on over into water, and there's 53,000. So all I'm really trying to show in this slide is that there's opportunities in the public water sector. They're highly fragmented, and over 30 some odd thousand of them are very small, under 500 customers. So what I actively talk a lot about is within the utility space, water is the lowest margin utility that we have. Telephone is actually, ironically, the highest margin utility. Natural gas is probably the second highest, and electric. So it's a real challenge for smaller towns to kind of keep the wheels on the bus, if you will, because the business of itself is really a low margin business. So walking into the next slide, I kind of titled it the small community paradox, and I want to kind of unpack a few things. So as I said earlier, majority of the water supplies in the U.S. are small communities. I talked a little bit about the low margin. Our business really is a low margin, high volume business. And the other challenge that small towns have is that they lack population density compared to more urban areas. And then, of course, because of the smaller size, they're going to have a limited technical, financial, and managerial capacity, which is kind of more, the EPA uses that terminology quite a bit in talking about smaller towns. The other issue that is somewhat of a paradox is that as all of us are required to meet standards, the clean air, I was over at a power plant earlier today, so I'm thinking electricity still in my mind. The Clean Water Act, as well as the Safe Drinking Water Act, those two pillars of legislation passed back in, I guess it was the 70s. That set up some baseline compliance requirements that all of us have to meet. And unfortunately, from a compliance perspective, it becomes a pretty high hurdle for smaller towns to meet those compliances because they just lack the numbers. It's a math problem with not having enough user base and density. Any type of compliance really it gets to be very expensive on a per user basis in smaller towns, and that's part of the struggle, and that's part of the leverage point that the smaller towns have an issue with. And then sliding into the base talk of today is economic development. I sit on a couple economic development boards in our area, and it's my belief that economic development, we really have to be keen to driving new jobs to keep our young folks living in the area. And so I'm very keen to, how do small towns position themselves to basically maximize opportunities and set themselves up for success. And when it comes to the utility side of the business, again, it's a struggle for the smaller towns to kind of do it on their own because with limited budgets, especially, we've been through the crash of 2008 roughly up until here recently. So that's really kind of most of the local city budgets have really gotten thin going through that process. So this is really going to be, I think, a problem going forward. Is how do we expand and grow to take advantage of some opportunities that present themselves to grow the local economy, grow the economic development platform that we need to do in all of our towns. So The other thing that here about 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago now, I was out in Washington, D.C., and I sat down with the Senate, or I'm sorry, the House Sub-Ag Committee on Appropriations, and both it was the ranking and the chair side, so both sides of the aisle, if you will. And they were asking a lot of good questions, which was, how are you guys going to, what are you guys going to do when the federal and state money somewhat dry up? And I think all of us should be attuned to the fact that from a budgetary perspective, we have some, $19 trillion, and certainly I don't want to get into politics of whether that's good or bad. But the point that I'm trying to drive at is that there seems to be a sense that the budgets, like was said earlier in the call, we get a lot of our funding from USDA Rural Development, and they've been an excellent source of funding. But when you look at the program over the last decade or two, we've gone from, say, a 60 loan, 40% grant program now into more of an 80-20 loan grant program. And on the CDBG side, which is funding through DCEO, the HUD Community Development Block Grant Program, that has seen cuts in funding. So the big challenge when you look at this from a go-forward basis, next 5-10 years out, is my sense is that we're going to be seeing less dollars. I mean, aside from whether you believe President Trump and his feelings about putting more money into infrastructure, that may be, and my sense is predominantly wrapped around the idea that I think P3s or public-private partnerships, I think that seems to be quite an interest, and that's been a buzzword in our business for probably the last 5-10 years. But P3s or public-private partnerships work a lot better, again, when you're in a more urban, high-densely populated area, because you do have the revenue streams out of these services that can help pay for the capital required. And actually, since you're talking about private investment, there has to be a return on that investment in capital. So that becomes more challenging when you talk about smaller towns. So that's kind of some ideas that we've had. So a couple ideas that I wanted to kind of at least toss out is the idea of long-term sustainability and kind of what does that mean, and especially for smaller towns, what are some of the questions that they should be asking. So kind of a general idea is a condition assessment. So when you have this report card, often like in school, we get a report card, and if you're a sports fanatic like I am, I'm always interested in, very competitive, and I like to see who wins and loses. But in a town, there's really not a win or loss. There's more the idea, what condition are our assets, and what types of things should we be looking at. And it's something that probably should be done at least on a every 5-year basis to really do a good scrub down in terms of, what is the condition of all of our assets? How are they performing? Because oftentimes in smaller towns especially, not a lot of attentions are put on our water and wastewater systems, and oftentimes they're kind of set at this run to fail is what we would call it, and really kind of put together more on a break and fix concept versus having a proactive plan forward. So the idea here is a condition assessment would be an excellent place to start, and there are resources such as like Rural Water as well as RCAP that can help you with those kinds of things. And the next thing would be, out of that assessment program is developing a capital budget plan. So, it's a lot of big fancy terms, but exactly what is that? Well, you're going to get this information out of this report card or this assessment, and the idea here is, okay, when we develop this, we're going to look at assets based on what kind of expenses do we anticipate them to be, say, in the next year or two, or the next 3 to 5 years, or the next 6 to 7 years, or the next 10 years. And so this kind of takes this conglomerate of information and somewhat puts it on a chronological timeline that you can mentally think about, okay, now how will we plan that out? And the idea, again, is not to wait for the thing to fail. It's to actually be proactive and say, okay, if I know, say, my water tower needs to have work in the next 5 years, you certainly don't want to wait till year 4.5 to actually do the work. It may make more sense to do the work, say, in year 2 or 3, because you'll extend the life of the water tower, and hopefully the cost of doing that work on a preventative maintenance perspective is going to be much less expensive than just like a car. So if you have a car and you never necessarily change the oil or do a whole lot of maintenance to it, the car's really not going to last as long as if it was properly maintained. You're going to get a lot more mileage out of the car. So that's the euphemism on that. The next item I have is the strategic plan. I'm a big proponent on that. And what that does, it kind of sets us up into this concept of what is our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You may say, well, what would something like that have to do with utilities? Well, we go through this every year at our utility, and we get input from all of our staff as well as our engineering and legal teams. And the idea is to really kind of shore up, and talk about in a very candid and open basis, what are our strengths? And typically, when you start talking about several people, you'll quickly learn that everyone is seeing more or less the same optic. What is our weaknesses? And then what does our opportunities look like? And of course, some of the threats. So this somewhat develops a prioritized list of kind of where you're at and what everyone kind of sees. And the fourth bullet here is really, to take a candid, non-emotional approach. Oftentimes, I know in our small town here in Dietrich, when EJ started, the local mayor, who is obviously no longer the mayor, 25 years later, he told us that, there was no need for EJ, everything was fine. And a lot of people do want to put their head in the sand and not really have candid conversations. So, what I really think is critical is to really make a difference. And can you hear me, Ann? Okay.
Yes, we still hear you.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay,
I was
good.
on mute, Bill. So yeah, you're coming.
No, you're fine. Well,
Yeah.
there was I apologize, everybody. There was a little bit of a tick on my end, and I'm like,
Okay.
I wonder if I lost everybody. So sorry about
No,
that.
you're good.
Okay, I'll get back into what I was saying. So I
There
think one of
was
the
one
critical
question. Hey, Bill, there was one question while we were interrupted about you were talking in the initial bullet about the condition assessment. So as you go through this, could you talk a little bit more about who does that assessment and how you go about that, a little more detail on
Yeah,
that?
yeah, no problem. And also I want to tee up to everybody, everyone's experience level in these subjects varies on the call, and I'm not sure who's along with what timeline. So I'm kind of going at this kind of at a high level, so if anybody does want to stop me on that. So the very basic concept of a condition assessment would be someone like, say, RCAP, which is a Rural Community Assistance Program. They could come in and do a condition assessment, and what it looks like is when's the last time your valves have been exercised? When's the last time your hydrants have been looked at, and what's the condition of those? So if you want to drive down and say like a valve, can you get on the valve? Is it frozen? When is the last time, again, had it been exercised? Because the problem with valves and hydrants both, if they're not really exercised often, it's no different than sitting on a couch, 24/7. Your body's just going to freeze up, and that's often what happens with hydrants and valves unless they've been exercised properly. I mean, the EPA does have standards that they're supposed to be, basically exercised so often, but unfortunately, in a practical sense, folks in a lot of your smaller towns, don't have time. It's not necessarily a priority, and it kind of slips off the to-do list. So by going through an actual exercise of condition assessment, you're going to get an idea of, what is the operating condition of my hydrants, what's the operating condition of my valves, and then look at all your meters, what's the condition of your meter boxes, how old are your meters themselves. I've been in this business about 15 years, and my background, I came out of the defense industry, so we were really very much statistical analysis and talked a lot about calibration. And, I was shocked in our industry that, like as an example, we didn't pull 20 meters a year just to check on calibration. So we since I've been here 15 years, we pull about 20 meters as a sample size every year just to make sure that as our system is aging, do we have a good handle on the fact that our meters are calibrated? Because if they're not calibrated, then you're losing revenue. Because you've got basically an instrument that's not performing like it could be. So at kind of a high level, that's what a condition assessment is. And RCAP, I'm kind of bragging on those guys. They do that type of work. So that's a group, as well as Rural Water can help you with condition assessment. Also, if those two entities, which typically those are free, if they're not available, possibly your engineer can help you, or you can reach out to possibly even like someone like us. We do condition assessments for smaller towns, especially ones in our service area, because we're interested in them performing at a high level. So I hope that kind of answered the question. Moving into the last bullet point, is this idea of developing this plan forward. So there's three options, as I always tell people. You can stay the course, which is basically do nothing. You can also look at, what is the economic impact if we actually go ahead and implement the capital, budget plan, which again is the information we got from the condition assessment. It's this body of information in terms of when should we do things and what kind of priority, and there's probably a certain value to that. And so one thing that I try to tell towns, and I do help a lot of different towns call, and I do help on a free basis. I'm surely not trying to get a lot more free work on the call here, so to speak, but we do help folks look at, what is their budget impact and what's the economic impact of decisions that may be made, because one thing that I guess I want to caution folks on the phone call, and I'm assuming most of you are either elected officials or folks interested in their water systems, is that oftentimes the engineering community does a great job in designing projects and developing all those things and getting them permitted, this, that, and the other. But one of the weaknesses that oftentimes happen in the engineering community is they're not your CPA, they're not your auditor, and so I would reach out and talk to your auditor, talk to a CPA, or somebody who has a lot of financial understanding to really get a good handle on, okay, when we do this, exactly what is it going to cost? Because that was something when I even got here 15 years ago, we were getting ready to embark on a very expensive project, and the board of directors really did not understand what it meant to, in our case, our members, our customers, what was going to be the impact on water rates. And I was shocked that nobody really walked through that economic impact analysis. And ultimately, in the case of this particular project, when I first got here, when the board truly understood the economic impact and what it was going to do to rates, they backed off because they didn't want to do it. And they somewhat thanked me to some, because again, you need to unpack the full story of what this does. And the other thing that I want to, again, I don't know if there's any engineers in the call, and certainly don't want to step on their toes, but engineers are paid typically on a percentage of the job. So if the job doesn't happen, they don't necessarily get paid. So unfortunately, there's somewhat, and there's good engineers. There's also engineers that I wish could do a better job. But I guess one thing, and I'll say it later in my slide deck, is always look for a second opinion. This is not a popular thing in our industry. A lot of engineers take offense to this, but it's okay in the medical industry that if a doctor gives you a certain hey, you need to do this, that, and the other, the doctor understands, hey, I'm just going to get a second opinion to make sure he's thinking straight. Well, I think the same approach should be taken on from the engineering perspective. It is to me good practice to have another set of eyeballs and someone possibly who is financially neutral on the decision to possibly look at something. And we do that. We've had an outside firm look at different scenarios and ways of thinking that have no financial impact to the outcome, and have an outside counsel, in my opinion, really does make for a much better decision and usually a better outcome. So the last item I want to mention this slide then is the idea of outsourcing. Oftentimes, some towns can save money by outsourcing. Some towns want to, I call it swim alone. Actually, I have a slide, kind of titled that. The idea is, why swim alone? When I was in high school, I did water safety and went through all that stuff. And one of the things that we were taught is, you never swim alone because you want to have a buddy with you, or whether you're lifting weights or any of that type of activity. So the idea with these towns is why swim alone? You don't have to do it by yourself. There is an opportunity oftentimes to either work with a neighboring town or possibly an entity like us that can help with discussions or look at opportunities to save money. because we've had numerous instances where we've partnered, and this is something that I've seen quite a bit with towns, is that it's pretty hard to partner on your sewer system, because sewer is a very local utility. So oftentimes I've heard from several mayors that, hey, we're going to go spend $5, $6, $7 million on a sewer system. We can't afford to do another $2, $3, $4 million water plant on top of this big sewer debt. And so that begins this discussion. Does it make sense to regionalize? Does it make sense to possibly outsource water treatment? What does that look like? What does it feel like? And usually that can become a very emotional conversation than maybe financial, but it is something that all towns should somewhat to look at. So moving into the next slide. So this is a little bit of a depressing slide, perhaps, but I did want to kind of vet this out. So these are the small system issues that everyone's facing. You've got an aging population. Oftentimes the population is declining, which really makes it bad because your user base is declining. So when you got to do projects and you got to divide it by this denominator, and that denominator, which is population user base, is declining, it makes the cost per user increase. And so that becomes really challenging. The other issue is you never really get to an economy of scale because you're just basically too small. And the bottom of the slide is really talking more about the culture and leadership issues that a lot of towns face, is that there's really not much employee leadership done. In other words, are you sending your staff out to, and I'm talking beyond just keeping their water license going. As an example, in our organization, we're developing 2 managers, and we've hired an executive coach where they're helping them through leadership and management issues on managing other people, managing situations, risk communication, and all these types of things. So that's one of the challenges that smaller towns or utilities have, because there's not a budget for leadership and development. Oftentimes there's not a real revenue budget, so there's no financial reserves, certainly maintenance reserves, and so these are just some challenges and that you face. So I'll kind of get off that depressing slide. So I kind of wanted to move into the next phase of this conversation, which is some partnering experiences that we've had, and I've got the slide titled "Why Swim Alone," using the euphemism I shared earlier. And so these are some things that we've done. The village of Watson, which is located just south of Effingham, what happened there? They needed a new water tower. They were going to build a 150,000-gallon tank. We needed a water tower in that area. So basically what happened is EJ paid the village $200,000 to upsize the water tower from 150,000 gallons to 250,000 gallons. And then we split the maintenance on a 60-40 basis. So the town doesn't have to do all that on their own. We love it because we don't have to have a water tower that we own, 100%. And it really became a good win-win. So for anyone who's ever traveled, on I-57 south of Effingham, if you think about it, look east as you're down there, and you'll see this pretty tall and pretty big water tower, and that's why the town did it. And of course, locally, the town, has an incredible ISO rating because they have a lot more storage that they could afford by themselves. And again, it was just a win-win. So that was a real great opportunity to collaborate and partner. The next item is really the village of Dietrich, which is, that's our home base. We're partnering with their 150,000-gallon elevated tank. We're expanding their interconnect. We're purchasing a rural water line that they really don't have use for, because it used to be how they had a well out there. And so the idea here is that we're bartering a lot of this so that the village doesn't have to put a lot of money into stuff, and we're wanting to expand our capacity in this area. So again, it's an opportunity for us to come to the village and work out, hey, when you look at this on a 5-10 year plan, what does it look like? And as I was saying earlier, with condition assessment and just the general idea of what is a plan, if you don't even have a plan, it's pretty hard to discuss openly with anybody, what are we going to try to accomplish in the next 5 to 10 years, because that vision hasn't been articulated. So that's a great thing that we're doing right now with the village of Dietrich. The next item is the village of St. Peter. They just needed a second water source just from a reliability standpoint, and so we provided them a second water source, and the payment was a barter, again, similar to Dietrich having a rural water line. St. Peter had a 10-mile line up to St. Elmo, and it had about 90 customers on it, so there was an obvious economic value to it. So we had a third party, evaluate what was the fair market of that, and basically it was used as a bartering dollar amount to get them a second interconnect, which is what they needed. So that we did that probably, I don't know, 10 years ago or so. So it's been a win-win, for the village. The next item is the St. Elmo. So that's a town along I-70 out in Fayette County. And that was kind of an interesting challenge. And so what that looked like, there's a company called Pinnacle Foods, and they had bought Wishbone and Western salad dressing, and they brought it into St. Elmo. So that was a significant change at the plant. And as if you can think, when you think about salad dressing, there's a lot of water in salad dressing. And so in a meeting that I was at, an economic development meeting, a comment was made, hey, they're going to ship a lot more product out of Effingham because there's a distribution center from Pinnacle. And so I'm going through the story to share with you that you need to connect dots. And so the dots that I quickly connected was, well, I knew St. Elmo was buying water from a neighboring system, and I knew that they didn't have that kind of water available because the neighboring system was actually buying peak water from us in the summertime. So I went to the mayor and said, hey, you guys are committing to this. Do you realize that you don't have that type, the kind of water it takes to do this type of product? So it made for some pretty uncomfortable meetings on the front end, but rather than watching it kind of fall apart and fail, and everyone kind of, because there is risk to it. When you jump in the front end of something, there's a risk of, how do you slow the car down? And do you get run over? And I guess what I'm advocating is to have those hard discussions, those hard things on the front end, because it does minimize problems on the back end. And so this is an example of us jumping into a situation which honestly, St. Elmo was not our customer. However, the neighboring water co-op was our customer. So we were pretty sensitive about, hey, we don't want to, cause them any harm. They're a neighbor. They were buying some water from us. And then also we thought, well, there's a possibility or opportunity for us to provide the load to St. Elmo. So what would that look like? And so we kind of walked through all that, and we ended up doing basically a three-way deal. We sell water to the neighboring system. That system sells water to St. Elmo, and of course they can provide, drinking water to the Pinnacle water plant. And the big thing too is, the Pinnacle food plant. The big thing there is, there was like 90 to 100 jobs at stake. So it was a big deal, big local employer. That employer put like a $50 million capex into the town, and so it really ended up being a great opportunity to really showcase how do you partner and how do you do all those things together. And so that was something that we were really proud to be a part of. The last item on the slide, and this happens to be my final slide before we enter into some Q&A time. In the map that we showed you earlier in my slide deck, you guys probably remember there was some water that we had up by Springfield, and it's not contiguous with our system, so we're buying water from an entity up there, and we're paying quite a bit of money for that water service, and realistically it's probably 2x what it possibly could be or should be. The pressure that I'm under, we're a member-owned co-op, and if you're a municipality, you're very sensitive about keeping water rates affordable to your customers. Is the board is directing me, hey, how do we solve this problem long term? So the easy answer is do nothing, and that gets back to the scenario we looked at earlier in the slide deck. The next step is, okay, if we were to try to buy water from somebody else, who could that potentially be? We evaluated those options, and there really wasn't an opportunity. exactly, for a varied amount of reasons. And then we started talking about, okay, we've already built 2 water plants with EJ in the last 8 years, so we know how to build water plants. What would it look like if we built a water plant up there? And then, of course, the other idea was, where would we want to do it, and then possibly look at partnering. So what's evolved into this is what we're calling the United Regional Water Co-op. So those on the call may have heard of Gateway Water out of Patoka. So it's kind of an offshoot of what those guys have done down there, but simply said what this is shaping up to be. And we're still in the planning stages of all this. Our 8 communities, just basically west and northwest of Decatur, that have water plants that have a lot of age to them, and they're going to have to do something. So the idea here is, does every community on their own make a, potentially a $3, $4, $5 million investment in capital to move their water plants into the 21st century? So since we're talking about 8 communities, and let's just for the sake of talking, let's say it's just $3 million. And so 8 times 3 is 24 million. So does all 8 towns put in 24 million? And then let's go further to say, because there is a town in that neighborhood that just recently got funded last year. They got a $2 million loan and $1 million grant. So of that 3, let's just say $1 million is grant money. So now you're looking at $8 million grant money, and the balance of that would be loan, which would be quite a bit of loan money for each individual town. So what we're proposing is, why don't we do a regionalized plant, and we're looking at a price tag in the $12 to $13 million range. So certainly a dramatically cheaper CapEx solution, and especially when you look at the user cost, per user, it is a much more affordable to go in with your neighbor to build a treatment plant. And of course, you're also doing something with economy of scale. It's a larger plant, so your actual production costs are going to be smaller. But again, you also leverage capacity. So now all the towns can leverage that capacity, as well as have a much more sophisticated water treatment plant than any one town could potentially afford themselves. So this is an idea where eight communities and EJ are going to go in together and build a United Regional Water Co-op, and that'll be the entity that owns it. That'll be the entity that is in charge of that particular plant, and EJ then is just now a partner. In this particular case, it's a one community, one vote, and EJ would have one vote as well on the board that would govern this entity. But again, it's a great opportunity to partner and to try to do things together. So that's why I went ahead and used that as another partnering experience that we're doing right now. So I'm looking at my time, and we're getting close to about 20 minutes to the hour. And so I was going to kind of break off into any kind of questions that may be in queue here. So trying to think here.
Bill, there's a couple questions on the chat box, and I don't know if you have that open, but one is from Kathy that asked for more detail on the capital budget plan. And you did mention your partners, USDA Rural Development and then DCEO from the state of Illinois, but I still think that is kind of a black box for people in decision-making roles, like the mayor of the town or elected officials who know that this is their responsibility, but they don't know the details of how that deal gets financed or how you even approach the potential partner. So I don't know what more you can say about that, but I wondered if there was a way to specifically address that, Kathy's, what's the capital budgeting process?
Yeah. So I could kind of walk through that briefly. So and again, I apologize, it's somewhat high level, but what it would look like, again, out of the assessment, you're going to have this idea of what are these things that need to get fixed. So maybe it's the meters need to be replaced. Maybe 6 or 7 hydrants need to be replaced. Maybe there's about 10, 15, 20 valves that are frozen and are inoperable. So you kind of walk, and then your water tower, is typically a very expensive asset, and and then also, if you're producing water, you're going to have probably an idea of things that need to really be fixed. And if you're filtering water, maybe the filters, the media needs to be replaced, say in 5, 8, 10 years, or your high service pump hasn't had anything done forever. So there's things that you can somewhat get a handle on in terms of what our future costs looking like, and somewhat through this condition assessment concept is park them into categories of time. So let's say there's a hydrant that's really, really bad. It happens to be at a very high traffic area. You talk to your local fire chief, and you say, hey, of all these hydrants that are out here, which would you think is the most important hydrant to be in operation? And he's going to give you, these 8 or 10 or 15 or whatever those are. And you want to make sure, as an example, that if those 8, 10, or 15 of those hydrants that he's talking about, or she, are these critical hydrants, you want to darn well make sure those are in operation. So as an example of that would be, if you know that one of these particular hydrants in his priority list really don't operate very well, the weep hole doesn't work, or doesn't seal properly, or hasn't been maintained at all, then you really want to go through and make sure that's one of the first things you fix in the coming, say, year. And so you go through every asset category, and you somewhat develop a storyline in terms of, okay, if it's going to be $200,000 to fix, say, like all of our meters, well, they probably don't all have to be done in year one. So you somewhat plan out, okay, in year one it could be this, year 3 it could be this, year 5 or year 8 or year 10. And actually, when you do this, you can do it on a simple spreadsheet. It's going to roll down these numbers, and then you're going to look at this and say, okay, well, we don't have $800,000 on year 4, or how much of a priority is it to fix this, and what happens if we don't fix it? Because oftentimes when you have these discussions with elected officials, a lot of times you'll hear this conversation, well, it's been working fine for the last, umpteen decades. Why in the hell we got to do it now? Well, again, that's because oftentimes our attitude of utility infrastructure is, it's below the ground, that water tower's up in the air, and we don't really think about it, we don't see it, and not until, for those that may have here, I think it was last week, the city of Normal had a big, water main break, and we're hearing more and more stories of this, and I'm not using these problems to somewhat sensationalize the issue, but these are systemic, red flags that are telling a lot of us that, hey, that 60, 70, 80-year-old pipe that's been in the ground is probably well beyond its useful life, and we should be looking at how do we replace it, how do we fix it. And again, if you never get it on a capital budget plan, you're not even thinking about it because it's not on anyone's radar. So this is really an opportunity to get everything kind of on a piece of paper, put it in a chronological time frame, and then develop a cost structure, and really just roll it up into chunks of every few years. And as a community, you may decide, hey, well, we can defer that. We don't need to do that right now, or maybe we should really look at this and get this fixed faster than we need. And so that's the idea of going through the capital budget plan. The next item here is Ann has a question. Ann, what would you like all mayors and local elected officials and decision makers to know about working with community water supply? Really good question. I think obviously there's a lot of caution when you start looking at should we regionalize with a partner or not, because it's safer to do nothing, to be quite honest. And we all are fairly cynical. We've all been burned by bad decisions, and of course in our business, especially, it's a conservative business. I mean, we are not Google. We're not out here on the leading edge of doing a lot of things crazy. So oftentimes a lot of the engagement with a community water supplier would be probably just having coffee with them, sitting down and just saying, hey, we're neighbors. We try to do that ourselves, but we don't do it as often as I would have liked to. Years ago when we were smaller, we did it a lot more, but we do try to reach out to our communities in our service area. But also, it wouldn't hurt for mayors and elected officials to also reach out to their neighboring supplier or whether it's a neighboring town, and just have a cup of coffee and just talk about what does the world look like in the next 5-10 years, and try to do a little bit of succession planning in terms of what does it look like, because there's a couple communities that I often point to down in Montgomery County that built basically water plants pretty close to the same time frame, and the towns are only seven miles apart. And to my knowledge, there was never really much discussion of could we do that together. And I guess, and I didn't talk a lot about this, but because I don't think around, depending on where you live in the state, sometimes there's not an awareness of really the kind of partner that really is going around. So let me quickly walk through that. The largest wholesale operator in the state of Illinois is the city of Chicago. And the city of Chicago is wholesaling, I think, roughly, last I heard, to around 140 different municipalities or entities. Certainly their biggest customer is the DuPage Water Commission, which is reselling water to member towns in DuPage County. But that is the biggest example of regionalized water, which is the city of Chicago. The other supplier up in the city area is Evanston, which is turning around and reselling a lot of water to numerous villages up there. And then the third large player would be the Joint Action Water Authority in Lake County, where they're selling water to several towns in Lake County, which is just north of Cook County. So that's an example of what's happening up north. Down south, probably the biggest wholesaler of water is Rend Lake, and Rend Lake is supplying water to some 45 different towns downstate. And then also Saline Valley, which is down in the southeast part of the state, down by El Dorado. That's another large regional supplier of water. And then Gateway that I mentioned earlier in my comments in Patoka, certainly us. You look at even Springfield is wholesaling quite a bit of water to neighboring communities. So every town has its typically they're wholesaling to a neighbor. So that happens a lot more than people sometimes think. But my advice would be just to have a cup of coffee and start having dialogue and seeing where that can go. So Margaret has a question here. Can you address the balance between economics of scale and production on the one hand, and then increasing distribution costs on the other? That's a good question. So, yeah, there is a problem in that. Oftentimes when you're a smaller system, you pretty much you've got a set amount of users, and if you're not growing, you're watching distribution costs increase every year, typically, because of either wage increases, just the cost of fixing maintenance and that type of thing. So the hard part is, how do you save money? And then, of course, the bigger thing is, where do you save the money? If you're really, truly trying to keep water rates affordable, the attacks that you have would be, how do you balance out the economy of scale in the production side? And there are opportunities to do that. But oftentimes, it's going to more or less either be automating some things, because if you're very labor intensive, and I don't see that as much now as I did, say, 5 or 10 years ago, but I still have seen water plants that are fairly labor intensive. And so there's an opportunity to go through the plant and automate that. You might have resistance either from the water operator or even the engineer, because one of the problems in our industry that we fall into is it's always been done that way and we can't do anything different. So I would challenge you in that area to really get either a third party to evaluate different options. But certainly a lot of small towns don't even know what their cost of production even is. So that's one thing. The question of cost of distribution versus cost. If you put those costs on a 5-year plan or 5-year spreadsheet, and we do ours is over 15 years actually, you can really start to see trends of what's going on and changes that you've made. Did they really have the economic impact that you thought? And so that takes a lot more discipline to go through that type of thing. But the information it yields is just incredible. And so one of the things that we've realized is that if we supply water to another town, as an example, we end up lowering our cost of production, which ends up saving our members money. And then, of course, we effectively can provide a lower cost opportunity for that town. On the distribution side, it's just a challenge because it depends how much labor is involved, as well as what can you do to keep those assets going and yet also keep it cost affordable. So the next question here is from, we got a colonel on the right now. McHenry County, hey, that's where I'm from. I'm from McHenry, actually. Went to McHenry High School. Might have missed the initial slides. Do you address the size of the population where you find the ability to go it alone as a village or a circle of cooperation, square miles? Yeah. I mean, well, I talked a little bit about the economy of scale issue and the size of population. Certainly, if you're a system that has, say 300 to 500 meters or potentially less, or even up to 1,000, probably the biggest thing I've seen within towns is that, and this is just some quick rule of thumb, your margin in this business is usually 10%. So as an example, let's say you got a $30 water bill. So if it's 10%, you only really have $3 per user per month to play with. And when I say play, I mean to pay for maintenance and do things on a proactive basis. So let's say you're a town of, say 200. Well, you've only got $600 now a month. And that really, in today's dollars, doesn't really stretch out too well. So the economy of scale plays into the fact that if you were a larger entity and had more meters, you can spread costs over, or even the impact of any kind of CapEx program over a larger base. As was said earlier in our slide deck, we have about 10,000 members, and we wholesale water to, about, I think it was 13, 14 towns, and we're getting ready to do a 15th right now. So we're always looking for opportunities to expand and grow, mainly because it keeps our water rates more affordable to our members, and oftentimes we're already leveraging our experience and what we do. We're just leveraging that, and again, as I mentioned earlier, we're a non-for-profit, so we're not an entity that's trying to make money. We're just really trying to recover costs based on on a not-for-profit basis. So the other thing I wanted to mention, if there's any other questions on that, I can certainly get that into another time frame. So they're not, these suckers are really going through the, let's see the next question here. Excellent discussion. Thanks for that. Can we have the PowerPoint will be available afterwards. Also, a tape of the conversation will be made available. Okay. Michael Bullard, we have recently formed Jefferson County Rural Water Association. Oh, good. Potentially 6 districts. Yeah, that's excellent. That will be members. Is there a good successful example of another countywide water association? Yeah, the question is yes. I mean, that's a great question. I'm a big believer in a lot of field trips. I travel a lot, and that's kind of why and how we've been able to grow EJ Water the way we have. Actually, and I'm going to make, I guess, a little bit of a plug. We started this, it's called Regional Water Organizations of America, or Association of Regional Water Organizations. Rural Water does an excellent job, and but the focus oftentimes is on smaller towns and for them really to keep their independence. The problem on a go-forward basis, I think, is with limited budgets, declining populations, and just the ability to really keep things simple. The idea of regionalizing makes an awful lot of sense. Now, we get tagged a lot of times because are we talking about consolidation? Well, sometimes we can be. Oftentimes, I'm talking more about partnering. You can outsource a lot of things and still yield great results. I mean, that's what Centralia did. Centralia could have went and got their own guy. Ironically, we're charging them about half of the full FTE and benefit costs to provide a superintendent. We're providing them probably more experience than they could singularly get because our viewpoint, we run 4 water plants. And so our experience level is a lot different than one person that just does one plant. And so I always feel that we're bringing best practice and a lot of a breadth of experience in what we see to that particular plant. So I do, there are examples, good water associations. I think Gateway Water is a good example of a good water association. I also believe that we were happy at EJ to help you guys in any way we can, and a lot of that happens to be how do you plug in with the board of directors or the leadership team, and do you share similar values, and do you kind of have a trust back and forth, and if those 2 examples aren't good, we can get you plugged into another group that can help you. So would be great to show a list of rural water associations statewide. Yeah, there is a list. I think Rural Water has a list of water associations statewide. And they vary too, by the way. Like one group I forgot to mention was Otter Lake. They're actually a water commission. So you don't exactly, like Wren Lake is not a water cooperative, not-for-profit. They're actually a water conservancy district, I believe. Saline Valley is also quasi-government. So those are different entities that you can do. Now, and I didn't get into this a lot, but the reasons why we were non-for-profit is that our local rural electric cooperative, which is Norris Electric, that's who kind of started us originally. And the man who founded us was very much a cooperative-based guy, so he felt like a non-for-profit co-op provided a lot of flexibility, and it does, and I'll explain that here briefly in just a few minutes I got left. Our model, we're non-for-profit, we're motivated not by profit, we're motivated by service. We don't have to comply with a lot of the state regulations such as Open Meetings Act. We were not required to pay prevailing wage on maintenance or even CapEx unless the funding dictates that. And then freedom of information. So all that type of government governance, we don't really have to comply with. Now, obviously, we comply with, the standards of the non-for-profit. We also have to comply with the EPA requirements since we're a, public water supply. But we have always felt that a non-for-profit model is much more nimble, much more flexible than the traditional water association or conservancy district that oftentimes is generated out of either an annexation out of a township, adopted through county, township, or municipal type arrangements. And that's just our way of thinking. But Otter Lake, I think, is a good example of a good water commission. They're out of kind of southwest of Springfield, so I think they run a good show as well. So, what is your email? Okay, I'll see. Okay, so we're just getting through the questions here. Trying to go through the
So, Bill, I put the link into our website, and as soon as we have edited this recording, we'll post it there so people can listen again and see your slides, etc. One thing, I was kind of looking around while you were talking about answering that question about a list of water cooperatives and water associations, and I didn't find a good list, so that may be something we would add to that list of resources if there is one.
Sure.
I mean, I didn't find one by Googling.
Yeah, it's funny you said that. That's probably there's probably not a good comprehensive list, but we certainly compile that and make that available to folks. So I know we're getting close to 1 hour, and I hope I guess everyone enjoyed the conversation. It was a lot of fun. I had fun doing it. I hope folks learned something, and certainly if there's a lot of interest, I mean, tell our organizers of the call that you'd like to either hear something more or I can be happy to talk more or whatever. So just however I can help you guys, I'd be
Thanks,
grateful
Bill.
to do that.
And we put a poll up now just as a way for us to see if we kind of hit the mark in terms of the level of the information that was provided. Bill, I know as you were preparing for this, we talked a little bit about should you provide a lot of detail and assume people know things, and I think you should, because this is the level that people are interested in knowing more, and if they find out they need they're lacking, they'll contact you, and thanks for that offer of help, or do a little digging. But I think it's important that we provide people with enough information that it's useful. So any more questions via the chat box for Bill before we sign off? I'll give people a minute to put questions in, but while we're doing that and you're filling out your poll, I just want to thank Bill. It's been really wonderful to work with you and to hear this story. It's a good story of providing service in areas that need it, and it's also a really good story of building a cooperative approach to the essential services that we need in rural communities. And that description of your funding partners, USDA Rural Development and DCEO, and how you pull all that together and make that package work, I think is, kind of the exciting part of that story. So I also, before you sign off, I just want to mention that next month is the webinar that we're gearing up for on broadband. It's same time, noon to 1 p.m. on April 20th. And we'll have Matt Johnson, and he will give us a federal perspective of broadband development, what the policy arena is, and what the potential is for broadband in Illinois. So we'll get a little bit more information out to you about what Matt's going to talk about, but that's another one of these, fascinating areas where if it works well, you don't think about it, and then, once you get into it, you realize it's a pretty complicated system that brings you that service, kind of like water.
Yeah, I think infrastructure is a way for us to stay plugged into, the urban center, and you got to have it on a go-forward basis. I mean, it's just critical for us to maintain that. So I can't say enough about towns that really stay on their game, because I think it matters. I mean, you want to have a can-do attitude. You want to have an attitude that, how do we solve problems and grow businesses? Because my daughter lives in Nashville, Tennessee, and it kind of is disheartening to my wife. But she went there obviously because there's a whole lot more fun things to do in Nashville than Dietrich, Illinois, for sure. But we're also hopeful that one day she can move back. But part of the move back concept is there has to be opportunities professionally for folks. We send them to college and they learn all this stuff, but they have to come back to something, and that's where I challenge all the towns to really work more on the business side of things. How do we help businesses grow? How do we help create opportunities for our next generation? Because if not, I think we'll continue to have population declines in a lot of our downstate areas. I'm just very passionate about that issue.
Bill, we had one final question. Eric asked, what is your one takeaway for promoting regionalization?
Oh, my takeaway?
Yep.
Well, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, a lot of folks would tell you, well, you're going to lose local control. I don't like the idea of someone else being involved, that type of thing. So, I'm not a lot of times I get tagged as I only think one way, and that's not true. I'm very cautious to talk about regionalization or consolidation because sometimes it doesn't work. Okay, I think when it can work is when you have common vision, common values, common goals, and there's this sense that, hey, we can do this together, as opposed to, as I said earlier in my comments, this idea of swimming alone. Well, swimming alone is a drag. Just like, as an example, if you're going to go on a vacation, do you want to go on a vacation by yourself? Although some of us might, but it's always fun to go with someone else because it's a shared experience, or with your family or your spouse or whatever your situation is. And so I think oftentimes, we get into the silo thinking, well, we have to do it alone because that's how it's always been done. But I do think that there are opportunities to regionalize, whether it's back office. We do a lot of, and I didn't talk a lot about this, but we do a lot of billing for towns because that's a shift that I see happening is the millennials don't open their mail, for one thing. And secondly, 40% of our payments now, and we're billing around 12, 13,000 people, 40% of our payments are credit card or ACH. So people are not writing checks. We send almost 3,000 electronic bills to people because they don't want even the paper bill anymore. And the problem that you have is that when you're a smaller, town, smaller village, you just don't have the resources or the IT to put all that stuff together. So we are doing more and more billing for towns. And so I'm not trying to self-promote us as EJ, but there are opportunities to maybe partner with the town and go it alone or go in with someone to do billing services or maintenance. It's a lot like sharing, say even a fire truck. You have this mutual aid concept, but oftentimes in towns, I don't see sometimes the ability to help one another. So I'm a bigger proponent that regionalization can work, but I'm cautious to say one size fits all. I hope that's a good answer.
A great answer. And it kind of supports kind of the development process that you described as you talked about the case examples, is that you really have to get the facts and understand the financial picture and the cooperative picture before you know if it's a good move to go forward or not. So it's a great way to illustrate the concepts that you presented earlier in the call.
Yeah, it's truly important, and I'm a cup of coffee kind of guy. I think it's important to have a cup of coffee with someone, look eyeball to eyeball, try to talk about what does the future look like together, or possibly look like together, and just really walk through problems, because oftentimes, most of the towns, one thing I did not mention is that we pull 26 mayors in together once a quarter and do a mayoral summit down here at EJ, and we're doing it really from an economic development standpoint. But the bigger issue is I'm trying to teach towns how to do better leadership. How do we help towns develop a vision, a plan forward? A lot of the towns, and we've had a few towns unfortunately fall off because they feel like they're so bad off that they can't get back on the rail, which breaks my heart. But one of the things I'm passionate about is I want all of our towns. I mean, Dietrich's a town of 600, okay, or 700. My graduating class, or well, not quite, was that much in high school, because I came from, McHenry, Illinois. So I'm trying to take more bigger town thinking, and I've been down here 30 years now, due to my wife living here. And I'm wanting to apply those lessons learned. How do we keep small towns relevant? Because if we don't do it, unfortunately, they're going to really, I think, be in peril, another 1 or 2 decades away. So, like Ann mentioned about broadband's critical for a town to continue to stay plugged in. Certainly water and wastewater services are critical, because, no town, you're not going to be able to recruit new folks to live in town, if your water isn't that great. And certainly, issues like in Sebring, Ohio, and Flint, Michigan, and others, those have highlighted some systemic problems that happen out here in the industry. So, we're getting wake-up calls and signals. I think we have opportunity to get in front of it, and just do what I think is a better job.
Bill, those are probably good. That's a good summary statement. And I want to echo what I see in the chat box of people who appreciate the information you've presented, and we really do appreciate the knowledge you brought and the case examples and the expertise that you bring to this discussion. It's nice to have you in Illinois, and especially working in rural Illinois. So thanks for everything and for sharing that with us. So with that, I'm going to welcome you all to join us again next month, April 20th, for our discussion on broadband. And hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.